June 17th, 1944. The skies over the Philippine Sea churned with the chaos of battle. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell's hands gripped the controls of his F-6F Hellcat, knuckles white beneath his flight gloves. Through his canopy, he could see them, hundreds of Japanese Zeros swarming like angry hornets against the American fleet below. The radio crackled with panic as carriers reported incoming waves. The harsh smell of engine oil and sweat filled his cockpit as the temperature climbed. His heart pounded against his chest, each beat a reminder of the impossible odds. "Too many!" someone shouted through the static. "There's too damn many!" McCampbell's squadron, Air Group 15, had been ordered to maintain defensive positions above the fleet. Standard doctrine dictated controlled, measured engagements. By the book, they would pick off the attackers in coordinated pairs, maintaining formation discipline. But McCampbell saw something different. The Japanese were coming in waves, their fighters escorting bombers in a massive coordinated strike. The American carriers would be overwhelmed if they followed standard tactics. His breathing quickened as calculations ran through his mind. The Hellcat had never been tested in sustained power dives at terminal velocity. It wasn't designed for it. Conventional wisdom said such maneuvers would tear the aircraft apart. In that moment, he made a decision that violated every tactical manual in the Navy. "Air Group 15, this is CAG. Forget your training. We're going high, then straight down through them. Maximum power dive. Push these birds to breaking point if you have to." His executive officer's voice crackled back. "Sir, that's suicide. The airframes can't." "The carriers die if we don't." McCampbell cut him off. "Follow me now." He yanked his stick back, pointing his Hellcat's nose toward the heavens, gaining altitude rapidly. His engine screamed in protest. The G-forces pressed him into his seat as sweat trickled down his forehead. Through gritted teeth, he managed 4 final words before the coming plunge. "Let's hunt some Zeros!" No one in the American Navy knew that one man's tactical rebellion that morning would forever change aerial combat doctrine and save an entire carrier task force from destruction. David McCampbell was born on January 7, 1910, in Bessemer, Alabama. He grew up in a modest home where his father worked as a steel mill engineer, instilling in young David a fascination with machines and how they worked. Unlike many future naval aviators, there was nothing particularly remarkable about his childhood. He wasn't born into military tradition or wealth. He was simply a bright, determined boy from small-town America who dreamed of something greater. His education was ordinary, West Bessemer High School, followed by 1 year at the Staunton Military Academy in Virginia. When he applied to Annapolis in 1928, no one expected particular greatness from the quiet, studious young man. His entrance scores were good, but not exceptional. He wasn't the most athletic candidate, nor the most charismatic. What set McCampbell apart was his methodical approach to problems and a quiet, unassuming confidence that borders on stubbornness when he believed he was right. At the Naval Academy, McCampbell was neither the top of his class nor its bottom. He graduated in 1933, ranked 155th in a class of 435, solidly middle of the pack. His instructors noted his competence, but rarely singled him out for special attention. During those Depression-era years at Annapolis, military careers were seen as secure rather than glamorous. McCampbell chose the Navy not for glory, but for stability and the chance to work with the machines he loved. After graduation, he was assigned to the cruiser USS Portland, where he served for 2 unremarkable years. When he applied for flight training in 1935, his commanding officer's recommendation was tepid at best. "Ensign McCampbell performs his duties adequately and shows reasonable aptitude. Approved for flight training if billets are available." At Pensacola Naval Air Station, McCampbell's true talents finally began to emerge. The instructors quickly noticed his extraordinary spatial awareness and instinctive understanding of aircraft behavior. Where others fought their planes, McCampbell seemed to communicate with his. One flight instructor wrote, "This officer doesn't just fly the aircraft, he becomes it." Still, his by-the-book approach and reserved demeanor kept him from standing out among the more flamboyant pilots. By 1937, he had earned his wings and began carrier qualification aboard USS Ranger. During one particularly difficult landing in rough seas, McCampbell's aircraft bounced heavily, nearly going over the side. Instead of freezing or overcorrecting, he made a series of minute adjustments that saved both himself and the aircraft. When asked later how he managed it, he simply shrugged and said, "The plane told me what it needed." This innate connection with his aircraft would later prove crucial, but at the time, it merely marked him as a competent, if unspectacular, naval aviator. Through the pre-war years, McCampbell served in various squadrons, slowly building experience while many of his more aggressive peers advanced more quickly. By 1941, when war loomed on the horizon, he was still only a lieutenant. His first wartime assignment wasn't even as a pilot, but as landing signal officer on the carrier USS Wasp. It was a crucial job, guiding pilots safely onto the deck, but hardly the glamorous combat role many aviators sought. Some whispered that his cautious nature had sidelined him. What they didn't understand was that McCampbell was absorbing everything, watching every pilot's approach, learning the limits of both man and machine. When USS Wasp was torpedoed and sunk in September 1942, McCampbell was reassigned to shore duty, training new pilots. Many saw this as further evidence that he wasn't cut out for frontline combat. Even his students sometimes questioned his insistence on understanding aircraft behavior in extreme conditions. "Sir, why are we practicing these edge-of-envelope maneuvers?" one student asked. "The manual says to avoid them." "Because someday," McCampbell replied quietly, "the manual might get you killed." He had no idea that soon, that understanding would be all that stood between America's vital carrier force and total destruction. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had reached a critical turning point. The United States, having recovered from the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor, was now on the offensive. The island-hopping campaign was pushing westward, with American forces securing footholds across the vast Pacific Ocean. But Japan, despite suffering significant setbacks, remained a formidable opponent with experienced pilots and capable aircraft. The Marianas Campaign represented a strategic necessity for American forces. These islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, would provide critical airfields within bombing range of Japan itself. For the Japanese High Command, the loss of these islands would create an unacceptable threat to the home islands. This understanding set the stage for one of the largest carrier battles in history. The American Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, included 15 aircraft carriers with nearly 900 aircraft. Task Force 58, the carrier strike force under Vice Admiral Mach represented the most powerful concentration of naval air power ever assembled. Their aircraft, particularly the F-6F Hellcat, had technical advantages over Japanese fighters, but numbers could still overwhelm quality. The Japanese mobile fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, included 9 carriers with approximately 473 aircraft. While outnumbered, the Japanese plan was audacious. They would use the Marianas Islands as bait, drawing the American carriers into range of land-based aircraft that could join the carrier-based planes in overwhelming the American fleet. On June 15, 1944, American forces landed on Saipan. The Japanese response was swift. Admiral Ozawa moved his fleet into position, preparing to launch a massive aerial counterattack. American intelligence detected this movement, and Task Force 58 moved to intercept. By June 19th, a day that would later be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, both fleets were positioning for the decisive engagement. The battle would largely be fought by aircraft, with the opposing ships never coming within sight of each other. What made this battle particularly crucial was the state of Japan's naval aviation. After the devastating losses at Midway 2 years earlier, the Japanese had rushed to train replacement pilots. These new aviators had received a fraction of the training their predecessors had enjoyed, sometimes as little as 300 hours compared to the 500 to 600 hours American pilots received. Many had never practiced combat maneuvers or firing at moving targets. The American intelligence assessment, however, underestimated the sheer number of aircraft the Japanese could commit. Captured documents later revealed that Admiral Ozawa had planned a series of massive consecutive waves, a tactic that had never been attempted on such a scale. The Japanese strategy relied on overwhelming American defenses through sheer numbers, accepting heavy losses to deliver a knockout blow to the carrier force. The American Combat Air Patrol, CAP, consisted of fighters positioned at various altitudes to intercept incoming raids. Standard doctrine called for disciplined, layered defenses, with fighters engaging in pairs or small groups to maintain mutual protection. Pilots were explicitly instructed to avoid wild maneuvers that might separate them from their wingmen or place undue stress on their aircraft. Naval Aviation Tactical Bulletin 1943-8 was explicit. Carrier aircraft will maintain formation integrity during interception. Power dives exceeding 60% of maximum airspeed are prohibited except in extreme emergency. Structural limitations may be exceeded. At 0500 hours on June 19th, radar operators on USS Lexington detected the first incoming Japanese raid at a distance of 150 miles. Initial reports estimated 60 to 70 aircraft. Within 30 minutes, this estimate had grown to over 150. By 0630, multiple raids were detected, and the true scale of the Japanese attack became apparent. Waves totaling over 300 aircraft were inbound. Commander Joseph Clifton, air defense officer aboard USS Lexington, later wrote, "The radar screens were practically solid with returns. It was unlike anything we had seen before, not one raid but many coming from different directions. It was clear they were throwing everything they had at us." Air Group 15, led by Lieutenant Commander McCampbell, was one of several fighter groups scrambled to meet this unprecedented threat. As they climbed to their assigned patrol altitude of 20,000 feet, the enormity of what they faced became visible, the horizon filled with incoming aircraft. Lieutenant James Johnson, one of McCampbell's wingmen, would later recall, "When I saw them, my mouth went dry. There were so many they looked like a cloud bank. I remember thinking, there aren't enough bullets in the fleet to shoot down that many planes." They had less than 15 minutes before the Japanese would reach the American task force, and in those moments, conventional tactics suddenly seemed woefully inadequate for the scale of the threat they faced. "CAG to group, hold at 25,000 feet. McCampbell's voice was steady as he guided his fighters higher than their assigned altitude. Several pilots exchanged confused glances. Standard interception doctrine called for positioning at staggered altitudes between 15 and 20,000 feet. "Sir, combat is directing us to 19,000. Over." His executive officer's voice crackled over the radio. McCampbell didn't respond immediately. Through his canopy, he studied the incoming Japanese formations. Years of training as a landing signal officer had honed his ability to read aircraft behavior and predict flight paths. What he saw worried him deeply. The Japanese were coming in at multiple altitudes, but their fighter escorts were concentrated around the middle layers, protecting the bombers. Standard American tactics would result in a series of isolated dogfights, exactly what the Japanese needed to get their bombers through. "Maintain climb to 25,000. Acknowledge." McCampbell's tone left no room for argument. One by one, his pilots responded, though several with noticeable hesitation. They were flying away from their assigned interception altitude, with hundreds of enemy aircraft bearing down on the fleet they were sworn to protect. Lieutenant Roy Rushing, one of the younger pilots in the squadron, keyed his microphone. "Sir, should we advise combat of our position change?" "Negative," McCampbell responded. "Radio discipline from here on." The tension in the cockpits was palpable. Every pilot knew that deviating from assigned combat air patrol stations was a serious breach of protocol. Battle doctrine had been developed through hard experience, and disregarding it wasn't done lightly. Several pilots were now sweating not just from the Pacific heat, but from the knowledge that they were effectively disobeying direct orders from the carrier's Combat Information Center. As they reached 25,000 feet, McCampbell banked his Hellcat slightly, allowing him to look down at the massive Japanese formation now clearly visible below them. From this height, he could see what those at lower altitudes could not: the pattern and structure of the entire enemy force. The Japanese had organized their aircraft with bombers in the center, protected by fighters above and to the sides, but with a noticeable gap in their upper coverage. Lieutenant Commander James Hill, McCampbell's operations officer, had served with him since 1942. He knew McCampbell wasn't one for reckless improvisation. "Keg, what are you seeing that we're not?" he asked privately on their squadron frequency. "They're vulnerable from above, Jimmy," McCampbell replied. "All their protection is layered to the sides. They're not expecting an attack from directly overhead." The executive officer's voice cut in, tension evident. "Sir, we're now getting explicit orders to descend to 18,000. Combat reports the first wave is 7 minutes from fleet defense perimeter." McCampbell watched the Japanese formation for several more seconds. The Hellcat fighters his men flew were superior to the Zero in almost every way except maneuverability. They had better armor, more firepower, and greater speed, but one capability had never been fully explored: the Hellcat's dive performance at maximum power. During his time as a trainer, McCampbell had pushed test aircraft to their limits, taking them to speeds that technical specifications warned against. He'd discovered that the Hellcat's airframe, while never designed for it, could withstand terminal velocity dives that would tear other aircraft apart. This knowledge wasn't in any manual, wasn't part of any official doctrine. "All fighters, this is CAG, new tactic." McCampbell's voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "We're going to hit them from directly above at maximum power dive, full throttle, nose down, through their entire formation. Pick your targets on the way down, fire in controlled bursts. Don't fixate on any single kill. Pull up only when you must." There was a moment of stunned silence on the radio. "Sir," his executive officer finally responded, "a power dive at that angle will push these birds way past red line. We've never—" "I've done it!" McCampbell cut him off. "The Hellcat can take it. The Zeros can't match this dive rate, and they'll break apart if they try. We hit them hard, then climb back up and repeat." Lieutenant Roy Rushing, who had questioned the altitude deviation earlier, spoke up. "Combat's going to have our wings for this, sir." "I'll worry about that after we save the fleet," McCampbell answered. "Anyone who doesn't think they can execute this maneuver, peel off now and follow standard doctrine. No questions asked. Not a single Hellcat broke formation." McCampbell checked his instruments one final time, then rolled his fighter inverted. "On my mark, maximum power dive. 3, 2, 1, execute." 12 Hellcats rolled over and pointed their noses directly at the Japanese formation 3,000 feet below. They pushed their throttles to full military power, something pilots were explicitly trained not to do in a dive. The fighters accelerated at a rate none of the pilots had experienced before. The airframes began to vibrate violently as they approached speeds well beyond their rated maximums. In his cockpit, McCampbell fought the increasing pressure, trying to push him back as his aircraft accelerated past 400 knots, then 450. Warning lights illuminated on his instrument panel. The control stick shuddered in his hand. The engine screamed at a pitch that couldn't be found in any training manual. The Japanese formation grew rapidly in his gunsight. At this speed, they had perhaps 2 seconds to acquire targets and fire before they would tear through the enemy formation. McCampbell centered his sight on a Zero escorting a bomber group, squeezed the trigger, and felt his Hellcat shudder as its .650 caliber machine guns opened fire. He caught a glimpse of the Zero erupting into flames, then another and another as he sliced through the formation. The Japanese pilots, caught completely by surprise by the Americans diving from directly above at speeds they couldn't comprehend, had no time to evade. Their reactions were visible, some trying desperately to climb, others breaking formation in panic, all of them suddenly vulnerable. Lieutenant James Hill, following close behind his commander, would later describe it. "It was like we were meteors falling through them. I've never seen such confusion in an enemy formation. They were breaking apart before we even fired, trying to avoid collisions as we came through them at speeds they couldn't believe possible." In less than 10 seconds, the 12 Hellcats had pierced the entire Japanese formation from top to bottom. As they pulled out of their dives, engines straining and airframes creaking under the G-forces, they left behind a scattered, disorganized enemy. Where there had been tight bomber formations with fighter escorts, there was now chaos. Aircraft colliding with each other, formations broken, coordination shattered. Lieutenant Rushing, who had been skeptical moments before, was the first to transmit after they recovered. My God. Hugo, that worked. I got 3, maybe 4 of them. McCampbell was already scanning the skies, looking upward. Reform at 25,000. We're going again. As his fighters clawed for altitude, McCampbell assessed the situation. The Japanese formations were trying to regroup, but their rigid training worked against them. Their doctrine called for specific positions and formations that were now impossible to reconstitute in the face of the American attack. The bombers, suddenly exposed without their fighter screen, were particularly vulnerable. Combat to CAG. What is your position? You are not at assigned altitude. The voice from the carrier was tight with anger and concern. CAG to combat. Engaging enemy formation from altitude advantage. Stand by for results. McCampbell kept his response deliberately vague. There would be time later for explanations and, if necessary, reprimands. As they regained their altitude, McCampbell could see the next wave of Japanese aircraft approaching from the northwest. The first wave was still trying to reorganize, their neat formations now a scattered mess of individual aircraft. Same tactic, different section of their formation, McCampbell ordered. They're still not looking up. Hit them hard. Again, the Hellcats rolled inverted and dove at full power. Again, their aircraft protested as they exceeded design limitations. And again, they tore through the Japanese formation with devastating effect. Lieutenant Commander Jack Blitch, flying as McCampbell's wingman, would later write in his after-action report, "I've never seen anything like it. We came through them so fast they couldn't react. Their Zeros tried to climb to intercept us after the first pass. But when they saw us coming down the second time, they actually began to dive away. Several of them suffered structural failures attempting to match our speed. By the third diving attack, word of their success had spread to other American fighter groups. Commander Charles Brewer, leading another Hellcat squadron, contacted McCampbell. SEG 15, this is CAG 17. We're seeing your results. Request permission to adopt your tactic. Affirmative, McCampbell responded. In maximum power dive from 25,000 feet. Full throttle all the way down. Don't try to dogfight on the way through. One pass, multiple targets, then climb back up. Within minutes, multiple squadrons of Hellcats were executing the same maneuver. The Japanese formation, already destabilized by the initial attacks, began to disintegrate completely. Bombers, finding themselves suddenly without escort, turned back or pressed on alone, easy prey for the American fighters. Lieutenant James Johnson later described watching a Zero break apart as its pilot tried to follow a Hellcat in its power dive. The wings just folded up and separated. They simply weren't built to handle those speeds or the structural stress of trying to pull out of such a dive. In his cockpit, McCampbell was tracking his fuel and ammunition carefully. Each diving attack burned precious fuel, and his ammunition was running low after multiple passes. But he could see the Japanese formations were now in complete disarray. The coordinated strike that had threatened to overwhelm the American fleet had been shattered. All fighters, this is CAG. One more pass. Then we escort any leakers that get through. The tide has turned. As they dove for the final time, McCampbell allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The technical manuals, the training protocols, the established doctrine, all had insisted that aircraft should never be pushed beyond certain limits. But understanding machines as he did, he had known the Hellcat could take more than the manuals claimed. That knowledge, combined with the tactical insight to exploit a weakness in the Japanese formation, had changed the course of the battle. By 9:30 that morning, what had begun as a massive coordinated strike by over 300 Japanese aircraft had been reduced to scattered groups of survivors desperately trying to find their carriers. American combat air patrols, now all employing McCampbell's diving tactic, continued to pick off stragglers. On the deck of USS Lexington, radar operators and combat information officers watched in amazement as the massive threat simply dissolved on their screens. "I've never seen anything like it," Lieutenant Commander Harrison Birch, the ship's combat information officer, would later testify. "1 minute we were tracking hundreds of inbound aircraft, and 30 minutes later they were just gone." The air defense officer next to him shook his head in disbelief. What the hell did McCampbell do up there? The first thing that struck Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell as he guided his Hellcat back toward the USS Essex was the ominous silence on the radio. Throughout the battle, the airwaves had been filled with combat chatter, terse warnings, target calls, occasional whoops of victory. Now, as he and his surviving pilots approached the carrier, the radio was eerily quiet. Every man in the formation knew they had won a tremendous victory, but they had done it by deliberately violating combat doctrine. As they entered the landing pattern, the air boss's voice finally broke the silence. Air Group 15, this is Pryfly. You are cleared to recover. CAG, you will report to the Admiral immediately upon landing. McCampbell acknowledged the order calmly, though his stomach tightened. Behind his oxygen mask, his face remained impassive as he concentrated on his approach. The Hellcat settled onto the deck, its tailhook catching the arresting wire with a familiar jolt. As ground crew swarmed around his fighter, he noticed the unusual number of senior officers on the flight deck, and none of them were smiling. Commander James de Bourne, the Essex's air officer, approached as McCampbell climbed down from his cockpit. The Admiral is waiting in flag plot, he said quietly. David, he's furious. You violated direct orders from combat. McCampbell nodded, removing his flight helmet. His face was streaked with sweat, his eyes red-rimmed from strain. How bad was it for the fleet? That's the thing, de Bourne replied, his voice dropping further. We didn't lose a single ship. The Japanese barely got within range. Most of their attack force never made it through. McCampbell's debriefing with Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, commander of Task Group 58.3, was closed door. Those waiting outside flag plot reported hearing raised voices. An hour later, McCampbell emerged, his expression unreadable. What happened? Lieutenant Hill asked, as McCampbell returned to the ready room where his pilots waited anxiously. I've been formally reprimanded for disregarding combat control instructions and exceeding aircraft performance limitations, McCampbell replied evenly. Then, unexpectedly, a small smile crossed his face. And then informally told that we saved the entire task force. The official after-action reports filed that evening were carefully worded. They described aggressive interception tactics and advantageous use of altitude disparities, without specifically mentioning the unauthorized power dives that had proven so devastating. The technical reports noted aircraft operated at maximum performance envelope, rather than admitting they had repeatedly exceeded design limitations. Lieutenant Commander Jack Blitch cornered McCampbell in the officers' mess late that night. They're burying what really happened, aren't they? McCampbell nodded slowly. The doctrine can't be wrong, Jack. Not officially. So we bent it, we didn't break it. But those dives were aggressive tactical maneuvers, McCampbell finished for him. That's what the report says. The truth, however, couldn't be entirely suppressed. Word spread throughout the fleet, first among pilots, then among deck crews, finally reaching the highest levels of Naval Aviation Command. While official reports maintained the fiction of doctrine-compliant tactics, the actual lessons of June 19th were being quietly studied and incorporated into fighter pilot training. By August 1944, the Naval Aviation Training Center at North Island had modified its advanced fighter tactics course to include what they carefully termed power separation maneuvers, essentially McCampbell's diving attack by another name. Instructors who had flown in the Marianas demonstrated the technique in training flights, though they were careful never to exceed official aircraft limitations during demonstrations. Lieutenant Roy Rushing, who had questioned McCampbell's tactic before seeing its effectiveness, was transferred to a training squadron in late 1944. We don't teach pilots to exceed the aircraft's design limitations, he told his students with a straight face. But you should know exactly what those limitations are. For McCampbell himself, the immediate aftermath was mixed. The official reprimand remained in his file, but 3 weeks after the battle, he was quietly awarded the Navy Cross. The citation carefully avoided mentioning his tactical innovations, instead praising his exceptional courage and skilled airmanship. In the meantime, his squadron continued flying combat missions, building an exceptional record. By the end of the war, David McCampbell would become the Navy's all-time leading ace, with 34 confirmed aerial victories. His tactical innovations were studied at the Naval War College, though often in historical context, rather than as deliberate violations of established doctrine. The official Navy tactical manuals were eventually revised to incorporate elements of his diving attack strategy, though they never acknowledged its origins in a moment of battlefield disobedience. Perhaps the most telling validation came in a private letter McCampbell received in 1946 from Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had been Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet during the battle. History will record the victory at the Philippine Sea as a turning point in the air war. What history may not adequately record is how conventional thinking nearly cost us that victory, and how one officer's willingness to trust his judgment when doctrine proved inadequate made all the difference. Some men follow orders, others understand when orders must yield to necessity. The Navy needs both, but treasures the latter. In the years following the war, the legend of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot grew. The battle was celebrated as an overwhelming American victory, with official tallies claiming 376 Japanese aircraft destroyed against only 26 American losses. What remained largely untold was how close the outcome might have been had conventional tactics been followed. Naval aviation gradually incorporated the lessons of McCampbell's improvisation. By the Korean War, power diving attacks had become standard fighter tactics. The aircraft themselves were redesigned with greater structural strength and more powerful engines, specifically to execute the maneuvers that McCampbell had pioneered under combat pressure. As for the man himself, David McCampbell returned to a quiet naval career after the war. He never sought publicity for his tactical innovation, and in interviews focused on the bravery of his pilots rather than his own decisions. When pressed about the famous diving attacks, he would typically deflect with a modest, "We just found a way to use the aircraft's capabilities effectively." He retired from the Navy in 1964 as a captain, his final fitness report noting his exceptional judgment and ability to make correct decisions under pressure. The official reprimand from June 1944 remained in his file until the day he retired, when it was quietly removed by order of the Chief of Naval Operations. In 1996, when the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola opened a special exhibition on the Battle of the Philippine Sea, one small display finally acknowledged the full story. Next to a model of an F-6F Hellcat was a simple placard that read, "On June 19, 1944, Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell led his fighters in a series of high-speed diving attacks that violated existing naval doctrine but shattered Japanese air formations. His willingness to exceed both tactical conventions and aircraft design limitations saved countless American lives and helped establish air superiority in the Pacific. Sometimes, the right decision means breaking the rules." McCampbell, then 86 years old, attended the exhibition opening. When a young naval aviator asked him how he had found the courage to disregard orders in the face of such overwhelming odds, the old pilot smiled slightly. "It wasn't courage," he replied. "It was mathematics. 300 Japanese aircraft against 40 of ours. The math said we couldn't win playing by the book, so we changed the equation." David McCampbell passed away on June 30, 1996, at the age of 86. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his Medal of Honor, his 34 aerial victories, and his distinguished naval career. What it didn't mention was perhaps his most important contribution: the moment when he chose to trust his own judgment over established doctrine, to push his aircraft beyond its supposed limits, and in doing so, changed the course of aerial warfare. The victory at the Philippine Sea marked the effective end of Japanese naval air power. Never again would the Imperial Japanese Navy be able to launch a massed aerial attack against American forces. The loss of hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable trained pilots in a single day was a blow from which they could not recover. Years later, Japanese pilots who survived the battle were interviewed by American military historians. Many spoke of the shocking experience of seeing American fighters diving through their formations at speeds they had thought impossible. Commander Saburo Shindo, who had led one of the few Japanese units to return to their carrier that day, recalled, "We had been told the American Hellcats were good, but predictable. They would fight according to their training. What we encountered that day was something we had never prepared for. Aircraft appearing from above, like lightning, moving faster than we thought possible. By the time we realized what was happening, our formations were already destroyed. In modern aerial combat training, the lesson of McCampbell's innovation is still taught, though often without attribution. Fighter pilots learn that doctrine exists to guide, not to constrain. That the ultimate measure of airmanship is not how well you follow the rules, but how effectively you accomplish the mission. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of David McCampbell's decision that June morning is not found in tactical manuals or aircraft design specifications, but in the Naval Aviation Cadet's Creed, which includes these words: "I will use my training and judgment to assess each situation, knowing when to follow procedure and when innovation is required." In the chaos of battle, when hundreds of enemy aircraft filled the skies over the Philippine Sea, one pilot looked beyond the limitations of doctrine and aircraft specifications. He saw not what his aircraft was designed to do, but what it could do when pushed to its absolute limits. In that moment of crisis, David McCampbell chose to break the rules rather than lose the battle. The question remains for those who study military leadership. Would you have made the same choice? Would you have risked your career, your aircraft, and your life on an untested tactic when conventional wisdom and direct orders told you otherwise? When the stakes were the lives of thousands of sailors and the fate of an entire fleet, would you have found the courage to trust your own judgment? David McCampbell did, and in doing so, he didn't just win a battle, he rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means.